I'm Wendy. I'm 34, and 3 weeks after I buried my husband, my sister stood up at a birthday party and tried to take half my house. Her son was turning 1. There was still a candle stuck in the cake. Cassandra tapped a fork against her glass, smiled at the whole room, and announced that the baby was Daniel's. Then she said she'd be taking half the house Daniel and I built with our own hands. She even held up a folded paper and called it his will. Every face in that kitchen turned toward me at the same time. I set my plate on the counter and said, "Oh, I see." What I did after that took exactly 9 days, and it started the second I drove home from that party. Because the quiet widow they were all watching wasn't the one who'd been blindsided. Daniel had seen this coming long before I ever did. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. Quiet, true-to-life tales about ordinary women who keep their composure when family turns on them, and who win by knowing exactly what they're worth. If boundaries and earned justice are why you're here, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. 3 weeks before the party, I stood at the front of a small church and held the room together because that's what I do. I'm an ER nurse, 11 years. When everything is falling apart, people look at the calmest person in the room, and somehow that person was always me. So I greeted the cousins. I thanked the neighbors. I refilled the coffee urn in the church basement while my own chest felt like a closed fist. Daniel was 41, a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, between his second cup of coffee and his first client call. No warning, no long goodbye. Just a phone ringing in my locker at the end of a night shift, and a charge nurse I'd worked beside for years saying my name in a voice I'd only ever used on other people. We built our house together, a 1920s wreck on Linden Street that everyone told us to bulldoze. We didn't. We spent 6 years stripping wallpaper, sanding floors, and arguing about paint while we paid it down to zero. $800,000 now? The realtor down the block kept telling me, like that was supposed to be comforting. It wasn't a number to me. It was the smell of sawdust and the sound of Daniel laughing at his own bad measurements. After the service, my mother hugged me too long, and my sister didn't come up at all. And in my coat pocket, unopened, was a plain white envelope his lawyer had pressed into my hand at the wake, with one line of Daniel's handwriting on the front that I couldn't bring myself to read yet. For 2 days after the funeral, I worked. People thought that was strange. I thought it was the only thing keeping me upright. The ER doesn't care that your husband is dead. A kid comes in with a broken arm and you set the splint, and for 90 seconds your hands know exactly what to do. At home, it was different. At home, the house was too quiet and too full of him at the same time. His reading glasses on the kitchen windowsill, his handwriting on the calendar. Daniel was an accountant, and he was careful in a way that used to make me roll my eyes. He labeled everything. He kept receipts I'd have thrown out. He had a folder for the folders. "One day you'll thank me," he used to say, sliding another document into another sleeve. I'd tell him I'd thank him by never having to look at any of it. On the third night, I finally sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't drink and the white envelope from the lawyer. The name on it was Greg Halloran, attorney at law. I didn't even know Daniel had a lawyer of his own. We'd done our basic paperwork together years ago, the way couples do. Wills, beneficiaries, the boring stuff you sign and forget. But this was something else. Something Daniel had set up quietly, on his own time, and never mentioned. I turned the envelope over in my hands twice. Then I set it back down, unopened, because I wasn't ready for his voice on paper. I told myself I'd open it when I was stronger. I had no idea I'd need it in 3 weeks. My mother called on a Sunday, and her voice was sweeter than it had been in months. That's the first thing I noticed. Margaret Calloway does not do sweet without a reason. "Wendy, honey," she said, "you have to come to little Mason's birthday. He's turning 1. Cassandra would be heartbroken if you weren't there." I sat on the bottom stair and pressed the phone to my ear. My sister and I hadn't spoken much since the funeral, where she'd stood near the back and left early. "I don't know if I'm up for a party, Mom," I said. There was a pause. "It would mean a lot to the family," she said. And there it was. The family. The way she always used it, like a door closing behind you. Cassandra is 31, 3 years younger than me, and her life had been coming apart all year. Her marriage to a man named Travis had ended badly. She'd lost the apartment in November. She was living back in Mom's spare room with the baby and a mountain of credit card debt that everyone whispered about and no one named. I knew all of that. I felt sorry for her even, so I said yes. Of course I'll come, I told my mother. He's my nephew. I heard her exhale, relieved. And at the time, I thought it was relief that I'd say yes. Later, I'd understand it was relief that the plan was on track. I bought Mason a stuffed elephant and a savings bond because that's what an aunt does. I had no idea I was buying a ticket to my own ambush. The night before the party, I worked a 12-hour shift because I'd told my manager I didn't need the bereavement time. She'd looked at me over her glasses and said, "Wendy, nobody's grading you on this." I told her I was fine. That's the thing about being the steady one. You get so good at it that you forget steady isn't the same as okay. My friend Dana, who's been my charge nurse for 6 years, caught me restocking a crash cart at 2 in the morning that didn't need restocking. "Go home," she said. "Sit in your house. Cry if you want." I told her crying didn't fix anything. She told me that wasn't the point. I drove home at dawn with the white envelope still in my bag, where it had lived for 3 weeks, because I kept meaning to open it and kept finding reasons not to. I'm not a woman who avoids things. In a trauma bay, I run toward the worst of it. But grief had made me slow in a way I didn't recognize in myself. And I hated it. I showered, I slept 4 hours, and I got up and put on the navy dress I'd worn to 2 christenings and 1 wedding. I looked at the woman in the mirror and tried to find the version of me who could walk into my mother's kitchen full of relatives and smile. I found enough of her to do it. I tucked the envelope into my purse out of habit more than intention. Then I drove the 11 minutes across town to my mother's house, where my sister was waiting with a fork and a glass and a story she'd been building for months. My mother's house always smells like cinnamon and lemon cleaner, and that day it smelled like both, plus the sugar of a sheet cake on the counter. The kitchen was full. Aunt Renata, 2 of my cousins, a couple of neighbors, Cassandra's friend from work. Everyone looked at me with that soft, tilted head pity people give the recently widowed, and I let them, because correcting it would have taken more than I had. Mason was adorable in a paper crown, banging a spoon on his high chair. Cassandra hovered over him in a way that felt staged, touching his hair, calling him Daniel's little man. Once, lightly, like a joke that wasn't a joke. I caught it. I filed it away the way I file a patient's offhand comment that doesn't fit the chart. Travis was there too, which surprised me, the ex-husband. Except he wasn't her ex, exactly. They'd been circling back together for months. He kept close to Cassandra and kept refilling her glass and his own. There was a tightness under the cheerfulness, a current I couldn't name. My mother kept glancing at the clock. Cassandra kept glancing at my mother. I helped cut the cake. I sang the song. I held my nephew for a minute and felt the old ache of a child Daniel and I never got to have, and I pushed it down because this wasn't the place. Then, just as people were licking frosting off plastic forks, my mother stepped to the center of the room and tapped a knife against a wine glass. "Everyone," she said, "Cassandra has something she'd like to share." And my sister stood up, smoothed her dress, and smiled at me like a cat that already had the bird. Cassandra let the room settle before she spoke, and I knew right then that she'd practiced this. "Most of you know the last few months have been hard for me," she began, and a few people nodded, ready to be moved. Raising Mason alone, the divorce, and now, losing Daniel. She let her voice catch on his name. "Because Daniel meant more to me than any of you knew." The kitchen went still. I felt the temperature of the room change, the way you feel a fever spike under your palm. Cassandra looked directly at me. "Mason is Daniel's son," she said. "Daniel and I were together before he got sick. He knew, and he wanted Mason taken care of." Somewhere behind me, Aunt Renata made a small sound. I didn't move. Cassandra reached into a folder on the counter and pulled out a sheet of paper, holding it up so everyone could see the stamp at the bottom. "This is Daniel's will," she said. He left provision for his son. So as Mason's inheritance, I'll be taking half of the house on Linden Street, half of $800,000. It's what he wanted. She set it down like a winning card. My mother had her hand pressed to her chest. My cousins stared at the floor. Travis stood behind Cassandra with his arms crossed and a look on his face that he thought was sympathy and was actually triumph. And there it was. My son is Daniel's, and as inheritance, I'll take half your house. Said out loud in my mother's kitchen, over a 1-year-old's birthday cake 3 weeks after I'd buried him. The whole room turned to me to watch me break. I understood, suddenly and completely, why my mother's voice had been so sweet on the phone. This wasn't a party. It was a setup. And I'd brought the elephant. Here is the thing nobody in that kitchen expected. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, though some part of me, the part that has stood in trauma bays at 3 in the morning and seen the worst of what people do, found it darkly, bitterly absurd. I almost laughed because I knew something Cassandra didn't, and the size of the gap between what she thought she was doing and what was actually true was, in that frozen second, almost too much to hold in. I didn't laugh. I'm not cruel, and there was a baby in a paper crown 10 feet away. I held it down the way you hold down everything in that job, and I let my face go calm and unreadable. Oh, I said. I see. The room had braced for screaming, for tears, for me to lunge at the paper on the counter. Instead, I picked up my plate, set it gently in the sink, and rinsed my fork like a guest with manners. Thank you for the party, Mom, I said. Mason looked happy. I crossed to the high chair, kissed my nephew's sticky forehead, and told him happy birthday. Then I picked up my purse and walked out the front door into the cold, while behind me the kitchen erupted into the murmur of people who hadn't gotten the show they'd been promised. I got in my car. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, perfectly steady, the way they always are. And then I reached into my purse, and my fingers found the white envelope from Greg Halloran that I'd carried unopened for 3 weeks. For the first time, I tore it open right there in my mother's driveway. I read the one line inside, and everything went very, very quiet. The envelope held a single index card, and on it, in Daniel's neat accountant's hand, were 2 sentences. If anyone ever fights you for this house, don't argue with them. Go to Greg. He has everything you'll need. That was it. No explanation, no name. Just Daniel, reaching out from 3 weeks dead to put a hand on my shoulder in my mother's driveway. I read it 4 times. I'm a practical woman, and I don't believe in signs, but I sat in that cold car and felt something settle in me that had been loose since the morning the phone rang in my locker. He knew. Somehow, before any of this, Daniel had known that someone would come for the house, and he'd built a wall around me that I couldn't even see yet. I drove home to Linden Street, 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes back, and let myself into the house we'd built. It was quiet and full of him, the way it always was now. I put the index card on the kitchen table and stared at it. He has everything you'll need. Everything for what? The will Cassandra waved around had looked official enough, with a stamp and a signature, and for one ugly second in that kitchen I'd wondered if Daniel had a life I didn't know about. 3 weeks of grief will make you doubt the solid ground under your own marriage. But Daniel's handwriting on that card was steadier than my own pulse, and it told me to wait, to not argue, to go to Greg. So I did the only thing the steady one ever does. I made a plan. I'd call the lawyer first thing Monday. And then my phone lit up with the first of what would be many messages from my mother. By the time I'd made tea, my phone had 11 messages. My mother led the charge. I know that was a shock, but you can't just walk out on family. Then, 20 minutes later, Cassandra is in a terrible spot. That baby is your husband's flesh and blood. Then Aunt Renata, who had clearly been recruited. Wendy, we all loved Daniel. Don't let pride get in the way of doing right by his son. I set the phone face down and drank my tea. People assume that silence means you're wavering. It usually means the opposite. The messages kept coming, and underneath the gentle ones was a harder edge, the family closing ranks around the version of the story that was easiest for them. My mother called at 9. I answered because not answering would have been a statement, and I wasn't ready to make statements yet. "Honey," she said, and her voice was doing the thing again, the sweet thing with the steel underneath. "I'm not saying give her everything. I'm saying give her something. For the baby. Just give her something, Wendy. For the baby." She'd say that sentence to me at least 4 more times over the next 9 days, and every time it would land a little heavier because she'd built it to be impossible to argue with. Refuse. And you're refusing a baby. I told her I was tired and needed to sleep. I told her we'd talk. I did not tell her about the index card or about Greg Halloran, or about the fact that for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief moving in me. It was quieter than anger and more useful. It was the focus I get right before a long, hard shift. I was going to need it. Cassandra waited 2 days before she came at me directly, and when she did, she dressed it up as kindness. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening with Travis in the car at the curb and a soft, rehearsed look on her face. "I don't want this to get ugly," she said on my porch, not quite asking to come in. "I really don't, Wendy. We're sisters." She had a folder under her arm, the same kind of folder from the party. "I had a lawyer draw up something simple. You just sign the house into both our names. We sell it, split it, and nobody has to go to court. It's cleaner for everyone, especially with the estate still open." I leaned against my own doorframe and looked at her. "The estate," I repeated. "How do you know the estate's still open?" Something flickered across her face, gone fast. "These things take a while, that's all," she said. "Everybody knows that. But everybody doesn't know that. Probate timelines aren't dinner table conversation." Someone had told her, or she'd been digging, and either way it meant this wasn't a grieving mother's desperate idea. It was a plan with a calendar. "We need it done before the estate closes," she added. And there was the calendar, right out loud. I took the folder she held out because refusing it would have ended the conversation, and I wanted to see what was in it more than I wanted to win the porch. "I'll look at it," I said. Her shoulders dropped in relief, the same relief my mother's voice had carried. They all thought relief meant winning. I closed the door, set the folder on the table next to Daniel's index card, and poured myself a glass of wine I actually intended to drink this time. I read every page of Cassandra's folder twice, the way I read a chart before I trust it. There was the transfer agreement, and clipped behind it, a photocopy of the will she'd waved at the party. And the more I read, the calmer I got, because it was wrong in ways a careful man would never have been wrong. The will named a bank for the escrow that Daniel and I had closed our account with 4 years ago. I remembered the afternoon we did it, because we'd argued about which credit union to switch to. Daniel would never have written a current will referencing a dead account. The date was off too. It listed Daniel's address as an apartment number, and we'd lived in a house with no apartment number for 6 years. And the signature. I'd signed 1,000 things next to that signature: mortgage papers and Christmas cards and the back of our wedding photos. This one had the right shape and the wrong sole. The loops were too careful, like someone tracing rather than writing. I didn't celebrate. That's the mistake people make. The rush of relief that makes you sloppy. I'm an ER nurse. I document. So I laid each page flat on the kitchen table, and I photographed every one of them with my phone, front and back, in good light. I noted the dead bank by name. I noted the wrong address. I noted the witness line at the bottom, which had a signature I didn't recognize, and the printed name beneath it, T. Boone, Travis. I didn't call Cassandra. I didn't call my mother. I put the folder in a drawer, set Daniel's index card on top of it, and wrote one thing on my own notepad. Call Greg Halloran, 8 in the morning. I kept my hands steady at that kitchen table the same way I keep them steady over a crashing patient. Slow, quiet, certain. If you've ever had your own family mistake your silence for surrender, then you already know exactly what I felt reading those pages. Stay with me. I promise the part where it turns is worth every minute. And if a calm woman finally being underestimated is your kind of story, hit subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Greg Halloran's office was downtown, above a bakery, in one of those old brick buildings with a slow elevator and good coffee in the waiting room. I drove the 20 minutes from Linden Street on Wednesday morning before my shift, wearing scrubs because I'd be heading straight to the hospital after. Greg was older than I expected, soft-spoken, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a way of listening that reminded me of the better doctors I work with. "I was wondering when you'd come in," he said, settling behind his desk. "Daniel told me you might not, for a while. He said you'd come when you were ready, or when you needed to." I put Daniel's index card on the desk between us. "Someone's claiming half my house," I said. "My sister. She says her baby is Daniel's, and she's got a will that says so." Greg didn't react the way people react to gossip. He reacted the way a man reacts when a plan he helped build is finally being used. He nodded slowly, opened a drawer, and took out a thick sealed folder with my name on it in Daniel's handwriting. "Daniel set this up about a year ago," he said. "He didn't tell you because he didn't want to worry you, and because he said if it never came up, you'd never need to know it existed." He rested his hand on the folder but didn't slide it over yet. He was very specific about one thing. He said there's a second envelope in here, sealed, and he asked me to tell you not to open that one until you actually need it. Not before. I looked at the folder, then at Greg. "Need it for what?" I asked. Greg almost smiled. "He said you'd know," he answered. Greg opened the folder and laid its contents out on the desk one piece at a time, and I watched a year of my husband's quiet planning unfold in front of me. First, the real will. Daniel's actual last will and testament, drafted by Greg's office, dated and signed and properly witnessed, naming me as his sole heir, with the house on Linden Street and everything else passing to me and me alone. "This is the document currently in probate," Greg said, "filed the week after he passed. It's the only will of Daniel's on record with the court. Second, the deed to the house, free and clear, both our names, paid in full. Third, a copy of a notarized statement Daniel had signed affirming he and I had no children and that no other person had any claim on the estate. And then, beneath all of it, a smaller sealed envelope, cream-colored with a line in Daniel's hand across the front. For Wendy, when needed." I reached for it, and Greg said gently, "Not yet, if you can help it." He was firm about that. He said the timing would matter. I pulled my hand back. It cost me something to do it, because everything in me wanted to tear it open and see whatever last piece my husband had left. But Daniel had never once steered me wrong in 12 years, and I wasn't going to start doubting him in a lawyer's office. So I picked up the sealed envelope and I held it. That small cream rectangle, light as nothing, with my name and his handwriting on it. I held it in my lap with both hands the way you hold something that matters more than it weighs. "The will Cassandra has," I told Greg, "references a bank account we closed 4 years ago." Greg's eyebrows went up. "Then we have a problem for her," he said. "Not for you." I carried the cream envelope home and set it on the kitchen table, propped against the salt shaker where I'd see it every time I walked past. I did not open it. I want to be honest about how hard that was. For 9 days, that envelope sat there with my husband's handwriting facing the room, and every single time I came through that door, exhausted from a shift or worn down by another round of my mother's messages, I thought about opening it. But Daniel had said the timing would matter, and Greg had said the same, and I have spent 11 years learning that the difference between a good outcome and a disaster is often just doing the right thing in the right order. So I let it sit. What I did instead was work the problem the way I knew how. Greg had told me, before I left, that the will Cassandra was passing around was not in the court file. There was no second will of Daniel's anywhere in probate. "If she files that document with the court," he'd said, "she'll be submitting a forged will. That's not a family squabble. That's a felony." He'd said it plainly, no drama, the way you'd tell someone their lab results. I thought about that on the drive home and through my next 2 shifts. My sister, drowning in debt, with a new boyfriend whose name was printed under a fake witness line, was about to walk into a courthouse and hand a judge a crime. And the family was lining up behind her, telling me to be reasonable, to give her something. For the baby. When silence didn't work on me, Cassandra changed weapons. She went public. On Thursday, my cousin texted me a screenshot. Cassandra had posted on her page, no names, but everyone knew. A long, weepy paragraph about how some people in her family were hiding a dead man's wishes and turning their backs on a grieving single mother and an innocent baby. Heartbreak emojis, a photo of Mason looking up at the camera with enormous eyes. The comments rolled in underneath. People who didn't know a thing about my marriage offering my sister strength and prayers, a few of them adding that blood is blood, and that poor child deserves what's his. I read every word, and then I set the phone down and finished folding my laundry. Here's what I understood, standing in my quiet bedroom on Linden Street. Cassandra fought with noise, lies, a stamped paper, a public crowd, a baby's photo. She was building a story loud enough that the truth would have to shout to be heard over it. And shouting was exactly what she wanted from me. If I went online and defended myself, I'd be the cold widow attacking a single mom. If I called everyone and pleaded my case, I'd be dragging Daniel's name through a fight. So I did neither. I would not fight her noise with more noise. I had a deed. I had a real will sitting in a courthouse. I had a folder of documents Daniel built before any of this began, and I had a cream envelope against my salt shaker that I hadn't even opened yet. Quiet things. Solid things. The kind of things that don't trend on anyone's page but hold up under oath. I let her have the internet. I was going to keep the truth. My mother asked me to come by on Friday, just the two of us, and I went. Because she's my mother and because I wanted to look her in the eye. She made coffee neither of us drank. And then, standing at her own kitchen sink with her back to me, she started to cry. Not the performed catch in the voice Cassandra used. Real crying, the kind that bends a person. She has nothing, Wendy, my mother said. No husband, no apartment. Those credit cards. And now a baby. If you don't help her, I don't know where they'll go. I lie awake picturing them in a car. She turned around, and her face was wet and old and frightened. And for one long moment I saw her not as the woman who'd helped set me up at a birthday party, but as a mother terrified that one of her daughters was going to fall off the edge of the world. I felt it pull at me, hard. That's the trap with family. They hand you their fear and call it your responsibility. Just give her something, she said again. For the baby, please. Just give her something, Wendy. For the baby. I crossed the kitchen and I held my mother while she shook, because I loved her and her fear was real even if her facts weren't. But over her shoulder, I made myself say it clearly inside my own head. Loving someone does not mean lying for them. Helping a child does not mean signing my house over to a forged will. I could be moved and still not be moved. I left before Cassandra got home. On my way to the car, my phone buzzed. Cassandra again. Filing with the court Monday. Sunday dinner. Whole family. Last chance to be reasonable. I could have hidden. That was an option, and I want to be clear that I considered it. I could have let Greg handle everything by mail, never set foot in my mother's house again. Let the court grind it out in its own slow time while I avoided the whole loud, ugly scene. That would have been the safe play. But I kept thinking about that kitchen full of relatives looking at me, waiting for me to break. And I kept thinking about Daniel's handwriting telling me not to argue but never telling me to run. There's a difference between not arguing and disappearing. So I made my decision standing in my own living room on Friday night. I would go to Sunday dinner. I would walk into that house with the whole family watching, the same way I'd walked out 3 weeks of grief and one ambush ago. And I would not go alone. I called Greg Saturday morning. She says she's filing Monday. I told him. There's a family dinner Sunday. Everyone will be there. She thinks I'm coming to give in. Greg was quiet for a second. Do you want me there? He asked. I hadn't even had to ask. Yes, I said. I think it should end where it started. He agreed to come. And then I stood in my kitchen and looked at the cream envelope against the salt shaker, the one Daniel had told me not to open until I needed it. For the first time, I understood that the moment was finally close. Not yet, but close. I touched the corner of it with one finger, the way you touch the hand of someone you miss, and I left it sitting there one more night. Sunday morning, 2 hours before I had to leave, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the cream envelope, and I finally opened it. My hands, which never shake, shook a little then. Inside was a single folded sheet of medical letterhead and a short note in Daniel's writing. The note said, "Wendy, if you're reading this, someone's claiming I'm someone's father. I'm not. I never told you because I never wanted you to feel it was a wall between us and the family we talked about. But I made a choice years ago, and I kept the proof, because proof beats a story every time. I love you. Don't argue with them. Just hand them this. D." Under the note was the letterhead, a urology clinic, a procedure date in the spring of 2022, a vasectomy with Daniel's name, his date of birth, the physician's signature, and clipped behind it, a second sheet, a post-procedure lab result, dated 8 weeks later, confirming the procedure had worked. Azoospermia, no sperm present. Confirmed. I read it twice, and then, alone in my quiet kitchen on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after I'd buried him, I laughed. I actually laughed. One short, helpless sound, because of course he had. Of course Daniel, who labeled his folders and kept receipts I'd have thrown away, had a dated medical record proving he could not possibly be the father of a child conceived in 2024. He'd been carrying my defense for 2 years without ever saying a word. I sat there and let myself cry and laugh at the same time, missing him so much it took my breath, and so grateful for his carefulness that I could have kissed every receipt he ever kept. Once I stopped laughing, the nurse in me took over, because the proof was good, but it had to be airtight. I laid it all out on the table and built the timeline the way I'd build a case for a doctor on rounds. Daniel's vasectomy, spring 2022. Confirmed sterile by lab work 8 weeks later, summer 2022. Mason, my nephew, had just turned 1, born in early 2025, which meant conceived around spring 2024. 2 full years after Daniel had a documented procedure and a documented result proving he could not father a child. It wasn't a he, she said. It wasn't my word against my sister's. It was a date against a date, signed by a physician, and dates don't cry on camera. I didn't trust myself to carry only one copy. I drove to the 24-hour pharmacy with a copier and made 3 sets. The real will from Greg's folder, the deed, the notarized statement, and now, the medical records. I put 1 set in a folder for the dinner, 1 set in my car, and 1 set back in the drawer at home. I texted Greg a photo of the medical letterhead. He called me back within a minute. "Wendy," he said, and for the first time he sounded something other than calm. "This ends it. A dated procedure 2 years before conception, with confirmatory lab work. There's no argument left to make. Bring it tonight." Then he added, quieter, "He really did think of everything, didn't he?" I looked at the note in Daniel's handwriting, propped against the salt shaker where the envelope had been. "He always did," I said. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt held, like my husband had reached across 3 weeks and a closed casket to stand behind me one more time. That afternoon, Travis made it worse for them without meaning to. He texted me, which surprised me, because we'd barely spoken in years. The message was him trying to be the reasonable man, smoothing the road. "Hey Wendy, just want this done clean for everyone. Sign the transfer tonight and we all move on. I already handled the witness part on the will so the paperwork's solid. You don't gotta worry about any of that side." I read it standing in my kitchen, and I went still. I already handled the witness part on the will. In writing. From the man whose printed name, T. Boone, sat under the witness line on a will Daniel never signed, a will that referenced a dead bank account and an address that didn't exist. Travis had just told me, in a text message, that he'd signed as a witness to a document my husband never wrote. That's not witnessing a will. That's forgery. And he'd put his hand to it, and then bragged about it to the one person it would hurt him with. I didn't reply with anything that would tip them off. I typed back something soft and stalling. I hear you. Let's talk tonight. Then I screenshotted his message, twice, and emailed it to myself and to Greg with the timestamp intact. He just admitted in writing to faking the witness signature, I wrote to Greg. Greg's reply came fast. Save it. Don't antagonize him. Bring everything tonight and let the document speak. I looked at the little stack of folders by my door. The deed, the real will, the medical records. And now a confession. Freely given, screenshotted and backed up. They'd spent months building a story. I'd spent one quiet week collecting facts. Tonight we'd see which one held. I've watched families fall apart in waiting rooms and pull together over nothing at all. So I knew the dinner ahead of me wasn't really about a house. It was about whether I'd let grief make me small enough to disappear. I wasn't going to. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself at exactly the wrong moment, comment one word, same, and subscribe, because the dinner table is next, and I'd been getting ready for it my whole quiet life. My mother called Saturday night for one last push, and I let her have her say. You'll come tomorrow, she said, and you'll be sensible. Cassandra's willing to settle for half. That's generous, considering she could take it all to court. I almost asked her if she believed it. If she truly believed her dead son-in-law had fathered her other daughter's baby, or if she'd just decided the easiest story was the true one because the true one let her stop lying awake. But I didn't. There wasn't any point. I'll be there, Mom, I said. And I'm bringing Daniel's lawyer. There was a long silence on the line. Why on earth would you do that? She said, and her voice had lost its sweetness. We're family. We don't need lawyers. Then it'll be a short conversation, I told her, and I meant it kindly. We hung up. I imagined she told Cassandra I was bringing a lawyer, and I imagined Cassandra took it as a sign of weakness, that I was so rattled I needed help, that I'd come to negotiate the terms of my own surrender. That's the thing about people who fight with noise. They can't hear quiet for what it is. They mistake a steady hand for a shaking one. I slept better that night than I had since the funeral. I laid out my clothes, the same navy dress, and I set the folders by the door. I put Daniel's handwritten note in my purse, not as evidence, but as company. And in the morning, I drove the 11 minutes across town to my mother's house for the third time in this story, except this time I wasn't walking in to be ambushed, and I wasn't walking in to surrender. I was walking in to finish it. Before I left, I stood in my living room and looked at our wedding photo on the mantel for a long minute. Daniel in a suit that didn't quite fit, me laughing at something off camera, the two of us on the front steps of the wreck we'd just bought and would spend 6 years saving. I thought about everything that was about to happen, and I made one more decision, the hardest one, and I made it on purpose so I wouldn't lose it in the heat of the room. Whatever Cassandra had done, Mason had done nothing. He was 1 year old. He didn't choose his mother's debts or her lies or the paper crown he'd worn while she used his birthday as a stage. He was my nephew, and that was real, and it would stay real no matter what came out at that table. So I decided, standing under my own roof, that I would protect myself and Daniel's name completely, and that I would still take care of that child, not through a forged will, not through extortion dressed up as inheritance. On my terms, in a clean way, because I wanted to, not because I was forced. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget under pressure. The truth, and then the kindness, in that order. Both. Then I picked up the folders, picked up my keys, and locked the door behind me. The drive across town was quiet. I didn't rehearse a speech. I'd learned a long time ago that the calmest thing you can do in a crisis is let the facts do the talking and stay out of their way. I had a folder full of facts. All I had to do was set it on the table and let it breathe. The house was full again, almost the same crowd as the party. Aunt Renata, the cousins, 2 neighbors, my mother hovering, Travis planted by the window with a beer. Mason was asleep in the back room. Someone had made a roast. The smell of it filled the house, warm and ordinary, which made everything underneath it feel stranger. People said hello to me carefully, the way you greet someone you expect to either cry or explode. Cassandra was at the head of the table, and she'd dressed for it, done her hair, put on the confident face. When I came in, she stood, and she didn't waste a second. "I'm glad you came, Wendy," she said, loud enough for the room. "I really hoped you'd be reasonable, because the way I see it, my son is Daniel's, and as his inheritance, I'll be taking half your house. We can do this the easy way tonight, or the hard way in court Monday. My son is Daniel's, and I'll take half your house." The same line, in the same kitchen, 3 weeks later. Except this time she'd built an audience for it, and this time she thought she'd already won. The relatives shifted in their seats. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. And then the front door opened behind me, and Greg Halloran stepped in a gray suit, carrying his own slim briefcase, and the whole room turned to look at the stranger. "Who's this?" Cassandra said, her confidence flickering for just a second. "This is Greg Halloran," I said, setting my folder down on the table. "He's the attorney who handled Daniel's estate." I pulled out a chair, sat down, and folded my hands. "Sit down, Cassandra," I said gently. "Let's talk about Daniel's will." Cassandra didn't sit. She doubled down, because that's all she had left. "I don't need a lawyer to know what's right," she said, and her voice climbed. "Daniel loved Mason. He told me he'd take care of him. Are you really going to look at this innocent baby and say no?" She turned to the room, working it. "She's got $800,000 in a house and she won't share a dime with her own nephew, her dead husband's son." My mother made a small sound and pressed her napkin to her mouth. Aunt Renata looked at me with open disapproval now. The pity finally curdled into judgment. "Wendy," my mother said, pleading, "just give her something. For the baby." The whole table leaned toward Cassandra, toward the easy story, toward the grieving single mother and the innocent child. I felt the old pull to smooth it over, to make the discomfort stop, the people-pleaser reflex that grief had been sanding at for weeks. I let it pass through me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply reached into my folder, took out the first set of papers, and laid them on the table where everyone could see. "Before anyone signs anything," I said quietly, "I think we should all look at the actual documents." "Greg?" Greg opened his briefcase. Cassandra's eyes went to the papers on the table and then to the lawyer, and for the first time something cold crossed her face. The realization that I hadn't come to surrender. The room got very quiet. Travis set down his beer, and I slid the first document into the center of the table, turned it so the print faced them, and let it sit there in the warm, roast-scented air of my mother's dining room. "This is Daniel's will," I said. "His real one." I kept my voice level, almost soft, so the room had to lean in to hear it. "Drafted by Mr. Halloran's office a year ago. Signed, dated, properly witnessed. Filed with the probate court the week after Daniel died. It leaves everything, the house, the savings, all of it, to me." Greg spoke then, in his unhurried lawyer's voice. "I can confirm that," he said. "This is the only will of Daniel Myers on file with the court. There is no other." Cassandra grabbed for her own folder fast and yanked out her paper. "That's not true. I have his will. Right here." She slapped it on the table next to mine. I didn't snatch it. I just looked at it, and then I looked at her, and I started calmly to point. "This one names First Heritage Bank for the escrow," I said. "Daniel and I closed that account 4 years ago. I remember the afternoon we did it." My finger moved down the page. "This lists his address as Unit 4B. We've lived in a house with no unit number for 6 years. Down again. And this witness signature here, printed underneath. T. Boone." I let the name sit in the air. Travis, by the window, went the specific gray of a man watching a floor open under him. "That's Travis," I said, "who witnessed a will my husband never wrote." Greg said a single clean sentence on top of it all. "Submitting that document to a court," he said, to the room, not unkindly, "is submitting a forged will. That's a felony in this state. For everyone who signed it. The relatives who'd been leaning toward Cassandra all pulled back at once, like a tide going out. My mother's napkin had frozen halfway to her face, and Cassandra, finally, said the thing she shouldn't have. But Mason is still his, she said. The will doesn't matter. Mason is Daniel's son. That was the door I'd been waiting for her to open. I didn't rush it. I reached into my folder, took out the last set of pages, and laid them in the center of the table beside the rest, turning them so the letterhead faced the room. This is a medical record from Daniel's urologist, I said. My voice stayed exactly where it had been. Quiet, even, a nurse reading a chart aloud. It's dated spring of 2022. It documents a vasectomy. And this second page is the lab result from 8 weeks later, confirming the procedure worked. Confirming Daniel could not father a child. I looked up at my sister. Mason was born in early 2025. He was conceived around spring of 2024. That's 2 years after Daniel had a documented procedure proving he couldn't have children. I let it land softly, which is the only way a thing that heavy can land. Daniel isn't Mason's father, Cassandra. He never was. And Daniel kept the proof for 2 years, in a sealed envelope, with a note to me, because some part of him knew that one day someone would stand up and say exactly what you just said. The room was utterly silent, and then Cassandra broke, the way the loud ones always break when the noise runs out. She snatched up the medical pages and threw them down. "That's fake," she shouted. "You faked that, you and your lawyer, to cheat my son out of—" Her voice cracked and climbed and cracked again. She shoved her chair back so hard it toppled and clattered against the floor. "You always do this. You always make everyone think you're so perfect, so calm, so much better than me." She was screaming now, in our mother's dining room, over a sleeping baby's head, and the more she screamed, the quieter and stiller I became, until the contrast was the only thing left in the room. I set Travis's screenshot on the table last, face up. "He told me himself he signed it," I said softly. Then I looked around at all of them, at every face that had turned to watch me break. "Oh," I said. "I see. And now everyone does too." The room turned all at once, the way a room does when a story it believed collapses in front of it. Aunt Renata stood up and stepped away from Cassandra like she'd caught fire. The cousins were staring at the medical letterhead, at the dates, doing the same simple arithmetic I'd done at my kitchen table. 2 years, documented, signed. Travis had already edged toward the door, and Greg, calm as ever, said to him, "You'll want to think very carefully about whether that will get filed Monday, Mr. Boone, and you may want your own attorney." Travis left without a word, the screen door banging behind him. Greg gathered the documents, squared them, and laid out the rest plainly for the room. No drama in his voice at all. A forged will submitted to probate is fraud. A false witness signature is forgery. Both are crimes, and both had names attached to them now, in writing, in front of witnesses. He said it the way you'd read a weather report. The relatives listened with their hands over their mouths. My mother had sunk into a chair, gray and small, and Cassandra stood in the wreck of her own performance, chair on its side behind her, mascara going, looking around a room that 20 minutes ago had been entirely hers and was now entirely not. I felt no rush of victory. I want to be honest about that, because the movies tell you this moment feels like winning. It didn't. It felt like watching a wound I'd hoped wasn't as deep as it turned out to be. This was still my sister. That was still my mother in the chair. The roast was still warm on the table no one was going to eat. I'd been right, and being right had cost everyone in the room something. I let the silence hold. Then I turned to my mother because she was the one I needed to speak to next. My mother found her voice first, and it was thin and broken. "Wendy, please, please don't send your sister to jail. She wasn't thinking. She's desperate. The baby." And there it was, one final time. The baby. The lever they'd been pulling for 9 days. But this time I had something to set down across from it. "I'm not going to the police," I said, to the whole room, but mostly to my mother. Not if this ends here, tonight, completely. The will doesn't get filed. The story stops. No more posts. No more calls. No more half my house. Cassandra signs a statement that there was never any claim, and she writes me one sentence of apology I can keep. I turned to my sister, who had stopped screaming and started crying the real way now. I'm not doing it to be cruel, I said. I'm doing it because I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder at a lie. Then I said the part I'd written down that morning so I wouldn't lose it. And Mason, I said, is still my nephew. He didn't do any of this. So I'm going to open a college fund for him. In my name, controlled by me, that no one else can touch. Not because anyone forced me. Because I loved your husband too once, before he was yours, and because that little boy deserves better than the people fighting over him. Cassandra looked up at me, wrecked, and for the first time in 9 days she didn't have anything to say. My mother put her face in her hands. The room stayed quiet. I picked up my folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. Greg has my number, I told them. Use a lawyer next time, it's cleaner. The estate closed 6 weeks later. Clean. The house on Linden Street is mine, free and clear, exactly as Daniel arranged it the week after he passed, without my ever knowing. Cassandra never filed the forged will. She signed the statement Greg drew up, and she sent me the one sentence I'd asked for, and I keep it in the same drawer as Daniel's index card. Not because I reread it, but because it's proof a thing happened that everyone would rather pretend didn't. Travis disappeared the way that kind of man disappears. He hasn't been around the family since, and no one asks. I opened the college fund for Mason the following month. A custodial account. My name on it. Money going in quietly every payday. I don't send updates. I don't make a show of it. One day, when he's old enough to understand any of this, he'll have a clean start that has nothing to do with the worst night his mother ever planned. My mother and I are careful with each other now. She calls sometimes. The sweetness is gone from her voice, and somehow that makes it more honest. She has never apologized, and I've stopped waiting for it, because waiting for an apology is just another way of letting someone hold the door closed behind you. I closed it myself. I keep my own keys now. I still work nights. The ER still doesn't care what's happening in your life, and most days I'm grateful for that. For 90 seconds where my hands know exactly what to do. The house is still too quiet and still full of him, but it's a softer kind of full now. His reading glasses are still on the windowsill. I haven't moved them. In the kitchen drawer under the apology and the index card is the folder Daniel built a year before he died, the one he never mentioned because he hoped I'd never need it. Some nights I take out his note and read the last line again. Proof beats a story every time. I love you. He was right. The careful, exasperating, wonderful man. He was right about all of it. Here's what I learned, and I'll keep it to one line. Grief doesn't make you an easy target. Not if the person who loved you spent his quiet hours making sure you'd never have to raise your voice to be believed. That's my story. One forged will. One sister who underestimated a quiet woman. And one husband who thought ahead. If this reminded you to keep your own paperwork in order, your will, your records, the truth in writing, take it as a sign and do it this week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.